The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the tarmac at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport, turning the asphalt into a shimmering sea of heat waves. Captain Marcus Webb stood beside his Gulfstream G650, arms crossed, watching his maintenance crew swarm around the starboard engine like ants around spilled honey. Sweat dripped down his temples despite his expensive aviator sunglasses and perfectly pressed pilot's uniform. "How long?" Marcus barked at his lead mechanic, Thomas, a burly man in his 50s with grease-stained coveralls and a perpetually worried expression. Thomas wiped his forehead with an oil-stained rag, leaving a dark smear across his weathered skin. "Captain Webb, I'm telling you, we've got a serious problem with the fuel control unit. The hydraulic pressure readings are all over the place. We're looking at least 6 hours, maybe 8 if we need to order parts from 8 hours. Marcus's voice rose sharply, cutting through the ambient noise of jet engines and ground crew chatter from nearby gates. "I have senators and CEOs waiting in Dallas. Do you understand what this delay costs? Not just money, Thomas. Reputation. My reputation." The heat seemed to intensify around them, the desert air dry and suffocating. A commercial airliner roared overhead, its shadow briefly offering respite before the sun's full force returned. Marcus could feel his shirt beginning to stick to his back beneath his uniform jacket. Thomas shifted uncomfortably, his boots scraping against the hot concrete. "Sir, with all due respect, this isn't something we can rush. The fuel systems on these jets are incredibly complex. If we miss something, we're not just talking about another delay. We're talking about catastrophic failure at 30,000 feet. Marcus clenched his jaw, his mind racing through calculations of lost revenue, angry clients, and the potential damage to his charter business, Elite Air Solutions. He'd built his company from nothing, working his way up from a commercial airline first officer to owning a fleet of 3 luxury jets. His client list read like a who's who of American business and politics. One delay could trigger a cascade of cancellations. The private aviation terminal bustled with activity behind them. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Marcus could see his passengers in the VIP lounge, checking their watches, making phone calls, their body language growing increasingly agitated. Among them was Senator Patricia Morrison, who had an absolutely non-negotiable budget hearing in Dallas that evening. Captain Webb, his operations manager Jennifer, approached with her tablet, her heels clicking against the tarmac with determined precision. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her expression conveyed everything Marcus already knew. "Senator Morrison's chief of staff just called. Again, they're exploring alternative transport options. Tell them we'll be wheels up within the hour," Marcus said, the words coming out before his brain could fully process them. Jennifer's eyebrows rose. "Sir, Thomas just said 8 hours. "I heard what Thomas said." Marcus turned back to his lead mechanic, who was now conferring with 2 other members of the maintenance team, their heads bent over a diagnostic tablet. "Thomas, what if we bypass the problematic unit entirely? Reroute through the secondary systems?" Thomas looked up, his expression somewhere between shock and professional obligation to not call his boss an idiot. "Captain, that's not how these systems work. You can't just bypass a fuel control unit. It's not like a blown fuse in your car. This is a $60 million aircraft with multiple redundant safety systems that all need to communicate perfectly. If we start jerry-rigging solutions, we're violating about 15 different FAA regulations, not to mention putting lives at risk." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth that Marcus didn't want to acknowledge. A bead of sweat ran down his spine. He'd been flying for 20 years, had logged over 12,000 hours, but his mechanical knowledge was functional at best. He could identify problems, describe symptoms, but the intricate ballet of hydraulics, fuel systems, and electronic controls was beyond his expertise. There has to be someone, Marcus muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Someone in this city who can fix this faster. Jennifer tapped on her tablet. I've already reached out to every certified Gulfstream mechanic within 100 miles. They're either already on jobs or can't get here for hours. A voice crackled over Thomas's radio, one of the other mechanics calling from inside the engine cowling. Thomas pressed the button. Say again, Bobby. The damage is worse than we thought. The entire fuel manifold is compromised. We're going to need to replace the whole assembly. Thomas's shoulders sagged. He looked at Marcus with something approaching sympathy. Captain, I'm sorry, but we're now looking at 12 to 16 hours minimum. We need to order parts from the Gulfstream facility in Savannah, even with expedited shipping. No? Marcus's voice was flat, final. No, that's not acceptable. Sir, I understand your frustration, but you clearly don't understand. Marcus pulled off his sunglasses, his blue eyes blazing. I have built this company on one principle: reliability. When people pay premium prices for private aviation, they're not just paying for luxury seats and champagne. They're paying for certainty. Certainty that they'll arrive on time every time. One delay like this, and I lose clients to NetJets, to Wheels Up, to every other competitor circling like vultures. Jennifer cleared her throat gently. Marcus, maybe we should be realistic about... Realistic? I'll tell you what's realistic, Jennifer. If I cancel this flight, Senator Morrison will never fly with us again. And when a United States senator stops using your service, everyone notices, everyone talks. Within a week, I'll see a 20% drop in bookings. Within a month, I'll be selling off one of the jets. Within 6 months, I'll be back to flying regional routes for someone else. The truth of his words settled over the group like the oppressive heat. Marcus had leveraged everything to build elite air solutions: his savings, his house, his reputation. He was one major setback away from losing it all. A ground crew member approached, a young man in his 20s with a radio and a clipboard. "Excuse me, Captain Webb, there's someone here to see you, says she can help with your maintenance issue." Marcus barely glanced at him. "Tell them we have a full crew. We don't need..." "She was pretty insistent, sir. Said she heard about the fuel control unit problem and that she specializes in Gulfstream systems." Thomas perked up slightly. "She? Did she say what company she's with?" The young man shrugged. "She didn't mention a company. She's waiting by the service entrance." Marcus exchanged glances with Thomas, who looked equally skeptical, but desperate enough to consider anything. "Fine, send her over, but make it quick." As the ground crew member jogged back toward the terminal, Jennifer leaned closer to Marcus. "Are you really going to let some random person work on a $60 million aircraft? If she's certified and can actually fix this, I don't care if she's from Mars." Marcus wiped his brow again, the heat making him irritable. "At this point, what do we have to lose?" Thomas organized his crew to continue their diagnostic work while they waited. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. Marcus paced beside the jet, each step burning through the thin soles of his dress shoes. He mentally composed and discarded various explanations to Senator Morrison, each one sounding more pathetic than the last. Then he saw her. Walking across the tarmac from the service entrance was a woman who looked like she'd just rolled out of bed after a particularly rough night. She wore paint-splattered overalls that were at least 2 sizes too big, cinched at the waist with what appeared to be a random piece of rope. Her boots were scuffed and mismatched, one black, one brown. A faded baseball cap covered most of her dark hair, which stuck out in random directions. Grease stains covered her hands and forearms, and there was a streak of what looked like hydraulic fluid across her left cheek. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. This was the specialist. This was the person who was going to save his aircraft. Thomas noticed her too, his expression shifting from hope to confusion. "Is that, She looks like she wandered off a construction site, Jennifer whispered, barely concealing her disdain. The woman approached with confident strides, seemingly unbothered by the judgment radiating from the group. She carried a worn toolbox that looked like it had survived several wars. As she got closer, Marcus could see she was probably in her early 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that were currently scanning the aircraft with professional assessment. "Captain Webb?" Her voice was clear and surprisingly authoritative, with a slight Western drawl that placed her origins somewhere in Texas or Oklahoma. "That's me." Marcus couldn't keep the skepticism from his voice. He gestured vaguely at her appearance. "And you are?" "Riley Cooper. I heard you've got a fuel control unit problem on your G650. She set down her toolbox and pulled a rag from her pocket, wiping her hands with practiced efficiency. "Mind if I take a look?" Marcus glanced at Thomas, who seemed torn between professional courtesy and obvious doubt. Jennifer made a small sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. "Ms. Cooper," Marcus began, trying to keep his tone neutral, "I appreciate you coming by, but we have a full maintenance crew from a certified facility working on this issue. I'm not sure what you think you can... You've got a catastrophic failure in the fuel manifold, probably caused by a faulty pressure regulator that's been gradually degrading over the last 100 flight hours." Riley interrupted, her eyes never leaving the aircraft. "Your diagnostic systems probably didn't catch it because the degradation was below the threshold parameters. The failure happened suddenly, but it's been building for weeks." Thomas's mouth opened slightly. "How could you possibly know that?" Riley finally looked at them, a small smile playing at her lips. "Because I've seen this exact failure pattern 7 times in the last 3 years. Gulfstreams are beautiful machines, but the G650's fuel system has a known issue with the pressure regulators manufactured between 2019 and 2021. Gulfstream issued a service bulletin about it, but it was advisory, not mandatory, so a lot of operators skipped it." Marcus felt a strange mixture of irritation and intrigue. "We perform all recommended maintenance." "Recommended, sure, but not advisory bulletins. Most operators don't." She walked closer to the aircraft, her eyes tracking along the engine cowling with the focus of someone reading a beloved book. "It's not cost-effective to implement every advisory bulletin, I get it, but this particular one should have been mandatory." Thomas stepped forward, his professional interest clearly overriding his skepticism about her appearance. "You really think you can diagnose this just by looking?" "I don't need to just look. I can hear it." Riley tilted her head, listening to something the rest of them couldn't perceive. "Your crew's been running diagnostics for the past 40 minutes. I could hear the engine cycling from inside the terminal. The hydraulic pump is cavitating. That's not normal. It means there's air in the fuel lines, which confirms the manifold breach." Marcus crossed his arms, feeling his patience wearing thin. The heat, the stress, and now this woman in ridiculous clothes, acting like she had all the answers. "Look, Miss Cooper, I'm sure you're very knowledgeable, but unless you have actual certification to work on Gulfstream aircraft, I can't let you touch my jet. FAA regulations, insurance requirements." Riley reached into her coveralls and pulled out a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a laminated card. "FAA airframe and power plant license with inspection authorization. Gulfstream factory certification, Rolls-Royce engine specialist certification, and a master's degree in aerospace engineering from MIT. She tucked the wallet back into her pocket. "Anything else?" The silence that followed was broken only by the distant whine of jet engines and the clicking of cooling metal. Marcus felt his face flush, though whether from heat or embarrassment he couldn't quite tell. He jumped to conclusions, made assumptions based on appearance, and now stood there feeling like an idiot. Jennifer recovered first. If you're so qualified, why do you look like that? Riley glanced down at her clothes with a shrug. I was rebuilding a transmission in my garage when I heard about your problem. Didn't exactly have time to change into my Sunday best. She looked back at Marcus, her expression neutral, but her eyes sharp. So, Captain Webb, do you want to keep standing here judging my fashion choices, or do you want me to fix your airplane so you can get Senator Morrison to Dallas? Marcus felt something shift in his chest. Pride warred with desperation, professionalism with practicality. He looked at Thomas, who gave him a subtle nod, the acknowledgement of one professional recognizing another, regardless of appearances. How long? Marcus asked quietly. Riley walked around the engine, her hands hovering near various components without touching, like a doctor examining a patient. She knelt down, peered up into the cowling, stood again. Her movements were precise, economical, the actions of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. 3 hours, she finally said. Maybe 2.5 if you've got the parts I need on hand, or can get them quickly. That's impossible, Thomas said. But his tone was more wondering than dismissive. We estimated 12 to 16 hours for this repair. Riley turned to him with a slight smile. That's because you're planning to replace the entire fuel manifold assembly. Am I right? Well, yes. That's the standard procedure, when standard procedure assumes you don't know exactly what failed and why, but I do. You don't need to replace the entire assembly. You need to replace 2 specific components, the primary pressure regulator and the secondary bypass valve. Everything else is fine. I can swap those parts, recalibrate the system, and run a full diagnostic in 3 hours. Marcus felt a surge of something he hadn't felt since this nightmare began. Hope. You're absolutely certain? Riley met his eyes directly. Captain Webb, I don't make promises I can't keep. Give me 3 hours and you'll be wheels up before dinner. But I need your crew to work with me, not against me. And I need you to trust that I know what I'm doing, regardless of how I look. The last statement hung in the air, a challenge and an olive branch simultaneously. Marcus realized that this moment would define not just the next few hours, but potentially his entire business. He could continue to judge based on appearances, following his prejudices to their logical conclusion of failure. Or he could do something he'd been telling his pilots for years. Trust the expert. He extended his hand. 3 hours, Ms. Cooper. Show me what you've got. Riley shook his hand firmly, her grip strong and confident despite the grease stains. Call me Riley, and I will. As she turned to consult with Thomas about parts and tools, Marcus caught Jennifer's eye. His operations manager looked stunned, caught between admiration and disbelief. You really think she can do this? Jennifer whispered. Marcus watched Riley already giving instructions to the maintenance crew, her commands clear and specific, her demeanor professional despite her disheveled appearance. The crew, initially resistant, was responding to her expertise, recognizing competence when they saw it in action. I think, Marcus said slowly, that I just learned a valuable lesson about assumptions. Now let's see if she can back up her confidence with results. The sun continued its relentless assault on the tarmac, but somehow the heat felt less oppressive. Marcus checked his watch. 3 hours. In 3 hours, he would either be thanking Riley Cooper for saving his business or watching his company circle the drain. Either way, he wouldn't forget the woman in the paint-splattered overalls who had walked onto his tarmac and challenged everything he thought he knew about expertise, professionalism, and the dangerous trap of judging books by their covers. The real work was just beginning. Riley Cooper knelt inside the engine cowling of the Gulfstream. Her body twisted at an uncomfortable angle as she worked in the cramped space between the fuel manifold and the engine-mounting frame. The metal around her radiated heat like an oven, and sweat dripped steadily from her chin onto the aircraft's inner workings. Her fingers, despite the oppressive temperature, moved with steady precision as she disconnected fuel lines from the faulty pressure regulator. "Torque wrench! 3/8 drive!" she called out, extending her left hand out of the cowling. Thomas appeared beside the opening, placing the requested tool in her palm with the efficiency of a surgical nurse. "You weren't kidding about knowing these systems?" Riley smiled despite the discomfort. "I did my thesis at MIT on fuel system optimization in long-range business jets. The G650 was one of my primary case studies." She applied controlled pressure to the wrench, feeling the fitting release with a satisfying click. Beautiful engineering, but they pushed the envelope too far on the pressure regulators, tried to save 3 pounds of weight per unit. In aerospace, sometimes those 3 pounds cost you reliability. From outside the cowling, she could hear the sounds of the airport continuing around them, ground crew vehicles beeping, the distant roar of departing aircraft, announcements over the PA system. But inside this mechanical womb, surrounded by fuel lines and hydraulic systems, Riley was in her element. This was where she made sense, where appearance didn't matter, where only competence spoke. Marcus's voice cut through her concentration. "How's it looking in there?" Riley extracted herself from the cowling, her coveralls now even more stained, with a colourful mixture of hydraulic fluid, jet fuel residue and sweat. She wiped her forehead with her forearm, leaving another streak of grease. Marcus stood about 10 feet away, maintaining a respectful distance from the work, but clearly struggling with the need to hover. "Right on schedule," Riley reported, consulting the mental checklist she'd been running since she started. "The primary regulator is out. I'm about to start on the bypass valve. Once both components are replaced, I'll need to run a pressure test before we can close everything up." Marcus nodded, but his body language radiated tension. His uniform, though still immaculate, showed sweat stains under the arms, and his hair had lost its earlier perfect styling. "The parts you needed, they were the right ones?" "Perfect match. Your supplier came through fast." Riley took a long drink from a water bottle that Thomas had thoughtfully provided, the liquid barely touching the dehydration she was experiencing. "Captain Webb, you need to relax. I know that's easy for me to say, but your stress is radiating off you like heat from this tarmac. It's making your crew nervous." Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Relax, right, while my entire business hangs in the balance." Riley set down the water bottle and walked closer to him. Close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the grey just beginning to show at his temples. Up close, without the barrier of his earlier judgment, she could see he was probably mid-40s, carrying the weight of significant responsibility on his shoulders. "Captain Webb, Marcus, can I tell you something?" She waited until he met her eyes. "I've worked on aircraft in worse conditions than this. I once repaired a bombardier's landing gear in a sandstorm in Dubai with half the tools I needed. I've fixed hydraulic failures at 30,000 feet while the plane was still flying. What you're experiencing right now, this is the easy part. The hard part is trusting people who don't fit your preconceptions." Marcus flinched slightly, and Riley saw recognition flash across his face. "You caught that, did you? My initial reaction to you. Hard to miss. You looked at me like I'd crawled out of a dumpster." Riley's tone was matter-of-fact, not accusatory. "Look, I get it. You see someone who looks like they just finished a demolition derby, and you're supposed to trust them with a $60 million aircraft. That's a big ask. But here's the thing. Some of the best mechanics I've ever known looked like they slept in their toolboxes. And some of the worst I've met wore designer coveralls and had pristine workshops." Marcus studied her for a long moment. "You didn't have to help us. You could have just walked away when you saw my reaction." "True, but that's not who I am." Riley turned back toward the aircraft, ready to resume work. "Besides, I love these machines. When I heard a G650 was in trouble, I couldn't just ignore it. That would be like a doctor walking past a car accident. She was about to climb back into the cowling when Marcus's voice stopped her. Why do you do this? I mean, with your qualifications, MIT, all those certifications, you could be working for Gulfstream directly, making serious money in a corner office. Instead, you're crawling around in engine compartments looking like, well, like you do. Riley paused, considering the question. It wasn't the first time someone had asked, but it was the first time today she'd felt like giving an honest answer. My dad was a crop duster in Oklahoma, she began, her voice taking on a distant quality. Flew an old air tractor AT-502, held together with duct tape, prayers, and my dad's mechanical genius. He didn't have fancy certifications or engineering degrees, just an instinct for machines and hands that could fix anything. She ran her hand along the smooth skin of the Gulfstream, feeling the warmth of the metal. I grew up in his hangar, learning to use tools before I could read properly. By the time I was 12, I could rebuild a carburetor. By 15, I was helping him overhaul engines. When I got into MIT, everyone said I was wasting my potential by staying hands-on after graduation. They said I should design aircraft, not repair them. But, Marcus prompted, but my dad died when I was 25. Engine failure during a spray run, mechanical problem that shouldn't have happened but did. He was alone, 30 feet off the ground, and didn't have time to recover. Riley's voice remained steady, though Marcus saw her jaw tighten. The investigation showed it was a faulty fuel pump that had gradually degraded, something that would have been caught with better maintenance protocols. "I'm sorry," Marcus said quietly. Riley shook her head. "After that, I made a decision. I could sit in an office pushing papers and designing systems, or I could be out here, hands-on, making sure aircraft don't fail, because someone missed something. I chose this. And yeah, maybe I don't look the part. Maybe I prioritize function over appearance. But every aircraft I keep flying, every repair I do right, that's my dad's legacy. That's me making sure what happened to him doesn't happen to someone else." The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Marcus felt something shift inside him, a recognition of shared purpose. He'd built his business to be reliable, to be the one people could count on. Riley had dedicated her life to the same principle, just from a different angle. "I judged you," Marcus said finally. "Before you even opened your mouth, I made assumptions about your competence based on how you looked. That was wrong, and I'm sorry." Riley met his eyes with a small smile. "Apology accepted. Now I need to get back to work, or your senator is going to miss her hearing." She climbed back into the cowling, her body disappearing into the mechanical labyrinth. Marcus watched for a moment, then turned to Jennifer, who had been standing nearby, observing the entire exchange with uncharacteristic quiet. "Make sure she has everything she needs," Marcus instructed. "Whatever she asks for, whatever it costs." Jennifer nodded. "Already on it. The replacement bypass valve is on the way from the supplier, should be here in 20 minutes. And I called the catering company to bring refreshments for the crew." "Good." Marcus checked his watch. 1 hour and 15 minutes had passed. Riley had promised 3 hours, which meant they should be wheels up by 4:30 p.m. It was tight, but possible. "Update Senator Morrison's staff. Tell them we're on track for a departure within 2 hours. Are you sure? If something goes wrong..." "Nothing's going to go wrong. Riley knows what she's doing." Marcus surprised himself with the certainty in his voice. 45 minutes ago, he'd been ready to dismiss her out of hand. Now, he was staking his reputation on her abilities. Jennifer studied him curiously. "You really trust her?" "I really do," Marcus confirmed, "and I think that says more about me than it does about her." Inside the cowling, Riley was working through one of the most delicate phases of the repair. The bypass valve, nestled between 3 other critical systems, required removing and replacing without disturbing the calibrated positioning of the surrounding components. One wrong move, one slip of the hand, and she could cause more damage than she was fixing. Her fingers worked by feel as much as by sight in the confined space. Years of experience guided her movements, the slight resistance that indicated a properly seated gasket, the subtle vibration through a wrench handle that told her the torque was approaching specification, the faint smell of different fluids that could indicate a leak or contamination. "Riley." Thomas's voice came from outside. "The bypass valve just arrived. Need me to pass it in?" "Hold on." Riley extracted herself again, blinking in the bright Arizona sunlight after the dimness of the engine compartment. Thomas held out a small, precisely machined component wrapped in protective packaging. Riley inspected it carefully, turning it over in her hands, checking for any signs of damage or defects. "Perfect," she declared. "This is exactly what we need." As she prepared to install the new component, a small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance. Maintenance crew from other aircraft, curious about the woman who had claimed she could fix in 3 hours what usually took half a day. Riley could feel their skeptical eyes, hear their whispered conversations. She'd experienced this her entire career, the doubt, the assumption that her gender, her appearance, her unconventional path made her less capable. She'd stopped caring about their opinions years ago. The only opinions that mattered were those of the machines she worked on, and machines didn't judge. They only cared about competence. Riley returned to the cowling, the new bypass valve carefully cradled in her hands. This was the critical moment. The installation required perfect alignment, exact torque specifications, and a steady hand. The temperature inside the cowling had to be over 120 degrees, making every movement exhausting. She positioned the valve, feeling for the alignment points with her fingertips. The metal was hot enough to be uncomfortable, but not quite hot enough to burn. She'd trained herself to work through discomfort, to focus through pain. The valve slid into place with a satisfying mechanical precision. "Torque wrench, beam type, 10 to 50 pound-feet range," she called out. The tool appeared in her waiting hand. She worked methodically, tightening each of the 6 mounting bolts in a star pattern, checking and rechecking the torque specifications. Too loose, and the valve could vibrate free during flight. Too tight, and she could strip the threads or crack the housing. 15 minutes later, Riley emerged from the cowling one final time, her face flushed and dripping with sweat, but her eyes bright with confidence. "Both components are installed," she announced to Marcus and Thomas. "Now we need to run a full pressure test of the fuel system. This is going to take about 45 minutes. We need to cycle the system through various pressure ranges and check for any leaks or anomalies." Marcus checked his watch. "That puts us at just under 3 hours total, right on your estimate." "I don't make promises I can't keep," Riley reminded him with a slight smile. She pulled off her baseball cap, wiping her forehead with her sleeve. Her hair was plastered to her head with sweat, and she looked like she'd just run a marathon in a sauna. "But we're not done yet. The pressure test is crucial. If there's any weakness in my repair, any seal that's not perfect, the test will show it." Thomas was already setting up the diagnostic equipment, connecting sensors to various points in the fuel system. Riley supervised, checking each connection, verifying each sensor placement. Despite her confidence, Marcus could see the careful attention she paid to every detail, the professional paranoia of someone who understood that small mistakes could have catastrophic consequences. "Starting the test sequence," Thomas announced, his fingers flying over the diagnostic tablet. "Initial pressure looks good, bringing it up to standard operating range." Numbers scrolled across the screen, pressure readings, flow rates, temperature measurements. Riley stood beside Thomas, her eyes scanning the data with practiced intensity. Marcus found himself holding his breath, though he barely understood what he was looking at. "Pressure holding steady at 1200 psi, Thomas reported. "No fluctuations, no drops. That's good. Really good." Riley nodded but said nothing, her focus absolute. They ran through a series of tests: pressure spikes to simulate takeoff conditions, rapid pressure changes to simulate altitude shifts, sustained high-pressure operations to simulate cruise conditions. Each test took several minutes, and with each passing test, Marcus felt his anxiety slowly transforming into genuine admiration. 20 minutes into the test sequence, a small alarm sounded on the diagnostic tablet. Riley and Thomas both leaned in simultaneously, their brows furrowed. Marcus felt his heart sink. "What is it? What's wrong?" Riley held up a hand, silencing him as she studied the readings. Her lips moved slightly as she calculated something in her head, her eyes darting between different data points on the screen. "It's nothing," she finally said, though Marcus noticed she didn't look away from the screen. "Just a minor pressure fluctuation in the secondary system, within acceptable parameters, but I want to understand why it's happening." "Is it your repair?" Marcus asked, trying to keep the worry from his voice. "No. The systems I repaired are performing perfectly. This is something else, something minor." Riley tapped the screen, pulling up historical data. "Thomas, do you have maintenance records for the past 6 months?" Thomas pulled up the files on a second tablet, scrolling through pages of service logs. Riley compared the current readings to historical patterns, her mind clearly working through complex calculations and correlations. "There," she pointed to a specific entry from 3 months ago. "You had a minor fluctuation in the secondary pressure system during routine maintenance. It was logged but marked as within acceptable range, and no action was taken." Thomas squinted at the entry. "Yeah, I remember that. We checked it out, didn't find anything wrong." "It's not wrong exactly, but it's the beginning of a pattern. The pressure relief valve in the secondary system is starting to degrade. Not failed, not even failing yet, but beginning to show early signs of age. Probably has another 1,000 flight hours before it becomes a real issue, but..." Riley looked up at Marcus. "You might want to schedule a replacement during your next major maintenance cycle. Catch it before it becomes a problem." Marcus felt a wave of respect wash over him. Riley hadn't just fixed the immediate crisis. She'd identified a future problem before it could become critical. "You can tell all that from one small fluctuation?" Riley shrugged, a gesture that seemed to minimize her obvious expertise. "Pattern recognition, data analysis. It's not magic, just experience and attention to detail. Most mechanics would have ignored that fluctuation, marked it as normal variation. But normal variation tells you stories if you know how to listen." The testing continued for another 25 minutes. Each subsequent test came back clean, the fuel system performing exactly as designed. When the final test completed, Thomas let out a long breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "All systems nominal," he reported, a note of wonder in his voice. "The repair is solid, better than solid. It's perfect." Riley allowed herself a satisfied smile. "Then we're done here. Captain Webb, your aircraft is ready to fly. I'd recommend a standard post-maintenance inspection, but the systems I worked on are guaranteed. If anything goes wrong with them in the next 1,000 flight hours, I'll fix it for free." Marcus stared at her. "You're guaranteeing your work? On a repair you did in less than 3 hours for an aircraft you'd never seen before today?" "I'm guaranteeing my work because I know it's right. That's how confidence works, Captain. You don't hedge your bets when you know you've done the job correctly." Riley began gathering her tools, packing them back into her worn toolbox with the same careful attention she'd shown during the entire repair. "How much do I owe you?" Marcus asked, reaching for his phone to initiate a payment. Riley paused in her packing, considering. Standard rate for a Gulfstream fuel system repair with emergency service would be around $10,000. But given the circumstances, the tight timeline, the skepticism I faced. She grinned. "Let's call it 5,000. Consider it a lesson fee discount." Marcus blinked. "You're charging me half because I was an ass to you when you arrived." No. I'm charging you half because you learned from it. Not everyone does. Plus, I enjoyed the challenge, and I've got a soft spot for people who are willing to admit when they're wrong. It's a rare quality. She closed her toolbox with a decisive snap. Wire the payment to the account Thomas has on file. He can give you my details. Jennifer appeared, having been summoned by Marcus moments earlier. Senator Morrison's staff says they're ready to board whenever we give the signal. Catering is restocking the cabin now. We can be wheels up in 20 minutes. Marcus looked at the Gulfstream, its engine cowling now properly secured, showing no external signs of the crisis that had threatened to derail his entire business. Then he looked at Riley, standing beside her toolbox, in her ridiculous paint-splattered coveralls, grease-stained and sweat-soaked, looking like she'd just survived a natural disaster. "Riley Cooper," Marcus said formally, extending his hand. "Thank you. You didn't just fix my aircraft, you saved my company, and you taught me something important about judgment and assumptions." Riley shook his hand, her grip firm despite the exhaustion Marcus could now see in her eyes. "Just doing my job, Captain Webb, though I will say this was more interesting than the transmission I was working on." "Would you consider doing more work for us? I mean, on contract, properly arranged? Someone with your skills and knowledge, we could use that. Elite Air Solutions could use that." Riley considered the offer for a moment, and Marcus saw something complex pass across her face. Interest, hesitation, something else he couldn't quite identify. "Let me think about it," she finally said. "Right now, I work independently by choice. I like the freedom, but I won't say no outright. You've got my contact information through Thomas. Call me if you need me." She hefted her toolbox and began walking back toward the terminal, her mismatched boots leaving faint prints on the hot tarmac. Marcus watched her go, this unlikely hero who had appeared when needed most and delivered results that exceeded all expectations. "Sir?" Jennifer prompted gently. "We should start boarding." "Right, yes. Let's get our passengers settled." But Marcus couldn't quite pull his attention away from Riley's departing figure. "Jennifer, make sure accounting processes that payment today and send her a bonus. Another 5,000. She earned it." "Consider it done." As Marcus headed toward the terminal to personally welcome Senator Morrison aboard, he felt lighter than he had in hours. The crisis had been averted, his reputation preserved, his business saved. But more than that, he'd learned something valuable about himself, about his assumptions, and about the danger of judging people by their appearance rather than their abilities. The Gulfstream sat ready on the tarmac, its engines soon to roar to life, carrying its passengers to their destination with the reliability that Riley had restored. And somewhere in a hangar or garage in Phoenix, a woman in paint-splattered overalls would return to whatever project she'd abandoned to help a stranger, her expertise unquestioned by the machines that knew her true worth. 3 weeks had passed since Riley Cooper had saved Marcus Webb's aircraft, and by extension, his business. In that time, Elite Air Solutions had experienced what Marcus could only describe as the smoothest operational period in the company's history. Every flight departed on time, every client was satisfied, and the revenue numbers were the best they'd been in 18 months. But something was gnawing at Marcus, a persistent thought that had taken root the day Riley walked off his tarmac and refused to leave him alone. He sat in his office at the private aviation terminal, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across his desk. Through the window, he could see 2 of his 3 Gulfstreams parked on the tarmac, pristine and ready. The third was currently en route from Los Angeles with a tech CEO aboard. Everything was running like clockwork, so why did he feel unsettled? A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. Thomas entered, carrying a tablet and wearing an expression that Marcus had learned to recognize as the bearer of unwelcome news. "We've got a situation," Thomas said without preamble. "The G650 that's inbound from LA, the one Riley worked on. It's showing some anomalies in the fuel system diagnostics." Marcus felt his stomach drop. What kind of anomalies? Nothing critical, nothing that requires an emergency landing. But the secondary pressure system, you remember Riley mentioned it might need attention during the next maintenance cycle. She said it had another 1,000 flight hours before becoming a problem. Right. Well, the degradation is happening faster than she predicted. It's not dangerous yet, but it's trending toward problematic. We need to address it sooner rather than later. Thomas set the tablet on Marcus's desk, showing a graph of pressure readings over the past 3 weeks. "See how the variance has increased. That's not normal. That's a system that's going to fail, probably within the next month of regular operations." Marcus studied the data, though his understanding was limited compared to Thomas's expertise. "Can your crew handle the repair?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably, a gesture that told Marcus everything he needed to know before the words came out. "We can handle it, yes, but it's going to take time. We'd need to ground the aircraft for at least 2 days, maybe 3. And honestly, after seeing Riley work, after watching her diagnose problems before they fully manifest." He trailed off, leaving the implication hanging. "You want to call Riley?" Marcus finished for him. "I think we should at least consult with her. She has an instinct for these systems that I've never seen before, and she guaranteed her previous work. If there's any connection between her repair and this developing issue, she needs to know." Marcus picked up his phone, finding Riley's contact information that he'd saved but never used. His thumb hovered over the call button for a moment, hesitation warring with pragmatism. Finally, he pressed dial. The phone rang 4 times before Riley answered. In the background, Marcus could hear what sounded like heavy machinery, metal clanging against metal, and someone shouting instructions. "Cooper," Riley answered, her voice slightly breathless. "This better be good. I'm in the middle of something." "Riley, it's Marcus Webb from Elite Air Solutions. We met 3 weeks ago when you—" "I remember who you are, Captain Webb. Kind of hard to forget the guy who looked at me like I was a stray dog before I fixed his $60 million aircraft. What can I do for you?" Marcus felt his face flush, despite being alone in his office. "I need your expertise again. The secondary pressure system you flagged during your repair is degrading faster than you projected. Thomas thinks we need to address it soon, and he suggested consulting with you." There was a pause, and the background noise diminished, as if Riley had moved to a quieter location. "How fast is it degrading? Give me the numbers." Marcus read off the data from Thomas's tablet, translating the graph into verbal descriptions as best he could. He heard Riley make small humming sounds as she processed the information. "That's faster than I expected," she finally said, and Marcus detected a note of concern in her voice. "But it's not related to my repair. The systems I worked on are completely independent of the secondary pressure circuit. This is the existing issue I flagged, just accelerating. Did you guys have any unusual flight profiles in the last 3 weeks? Lots of high-altitude operations, extended cruise times at max power?" Thomas, overhearing the question, nodded. Marcus relayed the confirmation. "We've been running some longer routes lately. Denver to Miami, Seattle to Dallas, that kind of thing." That would do it. High-altitude operations put more stress on the secondary pressure system. The relief valve I identified was already weakened, and the additional stress is pushing it toward failure faster than normal operations would. Riley paused, and Marcus heard what sounded like papers rustling. "When do you need this fixed? How soon can you get here?" Another pause. "I'm in Tucson right now, working on a helicopter restoration project. But if this is urgent, I can wrap up here and be in Phoenix by tomorrow morning. I'll need access to the aircraft for about 6 hours, maybe 8 if we find additional issues during the inspection." Marcus felt relief flood through him, followed immediately by guilt. He was disrupting her schedule, pulling her away from other work. All because his crew, though competent, couldn't match her expertise. Riley, I can't keep calling you every time we have an issue. It's not fair to you, and it's not a sustainable way to run a business. What you said about possibly working with us on contract, is that offer still something you'd consider? The silence that followed was longer this time, heavy with consideration. Marcus could almost hear the wheels turning in Riley's mind, weighing options, calculating implications. Captain Webb. Marcus, can I be honest with you? Riley's voice had shifted, becoming more serious, more personal than their professional exchange. I work independently because I've never found a company that respects what I do, how I do it, and who I am. Most places see a woman in grease-stained coveralls and assume I'm either a diversity hire or someone's assistant. The few times I've tried traditional employment, I ended up spending more time fighting to be taken seriously than actually doing my job. I understand that, and I know I was part of that problem when we first met, but that was ignorance, not malice, and I learned from it. Marcus leaned back in his chair, watching one of his jets taxi toward the runway. What if I could offer you something different? Not a traditional employee position, but a contract arrangement where you maintain autonomy but have regular work with Elite Air Solutions. You'd be our primary consultant for complex mechanical issues, but you'd still have freedom for your other projects. Why do you want this so badly? Riley asked, her tone curious rather than challenging. You have a full maintenance crew. They're competent professionals. They can handle 95% of what comes up. Because that remaining 5% is what defines excellence versus adequacy. And in this business, adequacy eventually becomes failure. My clients pay premium prices for premium service. That means aircraft that don't just meet FAA standards, but exceed them. That means solving problems before they become crises. You demonstrated that ability 3 weeks ago, and you're demonstrating it again right now. Marcus surprised himself with the passion in his voice. Plus, I'll be honest, having you available would help me sleep better at night. Riley laughed, a genuine sound that made Marcus smile despite himself. You're either very smart or very good at manipulation. I haven't decided which. Maybe both. Is that a yes? It's a, let me think about it while I drive to Phoenix tomorrow. I'll text you when I'm close to the airport. Have Thomas prepare the maintenance logs for the past 3 months. I want to see the complete operational history of that aircraft, and make sure your crew knows I'm coming. Last thing I need is territorial mechanics giving me attitude. Understood. And Riley, thank you. Again. Thank me when the jet's fixed and flying. Talk tomorrow, Captain. The call ended, and Marcus set down his phone with a mixture of satisfaction and anticipation. Thomas, who had been waiting patiently throughout the conversation, raised an eyebrow. She's coming? Tomorrow morning. She wants full maintenance logs and a clear workspace. Marcus stood, stretching muscles that had been tense since Thomas first walked in with bad news. Let's make sure she has everything she needs. And Thomas, I want the crew briefed on treating her with the same respect they'd show any expert consultant. No comments about her appearance, no doubts about her abilities, no testing or hazing. Clear? Thomas nodded approvingly. Crystal clear. I'll handle it personally, and for what it's worth, I think bringing her on contract would be one of the smartest decisions you've made since starting this company. After Thomas left, Marcus returned to the window, watching the constant ballet of aircraft coming and going from Phoenix Sky Harbor. Somewhere out there, Riley Cooper was wrapping up her current project, preparing to drive back to Phoenix to solve a problem that his own team couldn't handle as efficiently. He thought about her story, about her father, and the mechanical failure that had claimed his life. He thought about the lesson she'd taught him about assumptions and judgment, and he thought about the question she'd posed. Why did he want this so badly? The truth, he realized, was more complex than he'd admitted on the phone. Yes, Riley's technical expertise was extraordinary. Yes, having her available would improve operational reliability. But there was something else, something he'd been reluctant to acknowledge even to himself. Riley Cooper challenged him. She made him question his assumptions, forced him to confront his biases, pushed him to be better than he'd been before meeting her. In a business where complacency could be fatal, where routine bred carelessness, Riley represented something vital, a reminder that excellence required constant vigilance, constant learning, constant humility. His phone buzzed with a text message. Jennifer, his operations manager, confirming that the inbound G650 would land in 30 minutes and asking whether they should inform the passengers about the developing maintenance issue. Marcus considered the question. The issue wasn't dangerous, didn't require immediate grounding, wouldn't affect the current flight, but it was real, would need addressing, represented the kind of problem that could cascade into crisis if ignored. He texted back, "Inform them of routine maintenance scheduled for tomorrow. Be honest but professional. Emphasize our proactive approach to maintenance." Another text arrived, this one from Riley. "Sending you my standard contract template. Look it over tonight. If it works for you, we can formalize things tomorrow. Fair warning, I'm expensive but worth it." Marcus opened the attached document, scanning through the terms. Riley's rates were indeed premium, but not unreasonable for someone with her qualifications and expertise. The contract was surprisingly comprehensive, covering everything from response times to intellectual property rights to termination clauses. What struck Marcus most was a specific clause near the end. The consultant shall maintain autonomy in methods and approach to all technical work. The client agrees to evaluate the consultant based solely on results and professional competence, without regard to appearance, methodology, or adherence to traditional industry presentation standards. Marcus smiled. Riley had codified the lesson she'd taught him, making it a contractual requirement that she be judged by her work, not her appearance. It was both protective and educational, a reminder that the client needed to maintain the same standard they'd, hopefully, learned. He typed out a reply. "Contract looks good. A few minor questions, but nothing major. Bring a signed copy tomorrow, and we'll make it official." The G650 landed 15 minutes later, taxiing to the Elite Air Solutions terminal with the smooth precision that characterized all of Marcus's operations. He watched it park, saw the passengers disembark, noted their satisfied expressions. Another successful flight, another group of clients who would likely book again. But in the back of his mind, Marcus was already thinking about tomorrow, about Riley arriving with her worn toolbox and paint-splattered coveralls, about watching her work with that combination of confidence and precision that had saved his business once and was about to do it again. He pulled up his email and began drafting a message to his entire staff, from the maintenance crew to the flight attendants to the administrative team. Tomorrow, Riley Cooper will be on site to address a maintenance issue with our G650. Riley is a highly qualified specialist with credentials that exceed most people in our industry. She is also unconventional in her appearance and approach. I want everyone to understand that Riley's methods and presentation are her choice and her right. She will be treated with the same professional respect we show any expert consultant. This is not optional. This is not a request. This is a fundamental expectation of how we operate at Elite Air Solutions. We judge people by their abilities and their results, not by how they look or how they match our preconceptions of professionalism. If anyone has a problem with this policy, see me directly. Otherwise, I expect full cooperation and respect. Marcus read the email twice before sending it. It was unusually direct for him, almost aggressive in its tone. But 3 weeks of reflection had convinced him that the lesson Riley had taught him was too important to be kept private. His entire team needed to understand this principle, needed to internalize it, needed to make it part of the company culture. He hit send and watched the message propagate through the company email system. Within minutes, replies started coming back. Acknowledgements, agreements, some confusion from staff who hadn't witnessed the original incident, but accepted the directive nonetheless. Jennifer called his office phone rather than texting. That email was quite something. Want to tell me what prompted it? Marcus considered how much to share. Jennifer had been there the day Riley first appeared, had seen his initial reaction, his skepticism, his eventual acceptance. She knew the story. I've been thinking about how close we came to turning away the person who saved our business because she didn't look the part. And I've been thinking about how many other talented people we might have overlooked or dismissed over the years for similar reasons. This isn't just about Riley, Jennifer. This is about making sure we're actually as professional as we claim to be. So this is personal, Jennifer observed, her tone neutral. This is professional, Marcus corrected. But yes, it's also personal. Riley taught me something important, and I'm not going to let that lesson go to waste. Jennifer was quiet for a moment. For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing. That day, when Riley showed up looking like she did, my first instinct was to dismiss her too. I didn't say it out loud, but I thought it, and I was completely wrong. If you're codifying that lesson for the whole company, I'm behind you. After the call ended, Marcus remained in his office as the sun set over Phoenix, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The day shift was ending, the night crew taking over, the constant rhythm of the aviation business continuing unabated. Tomorrow, Riley would arrive. She would fix the problem with the secondary pressure system, and if things went according to plan, she would sign a contract that would make her a regular presence at Elite Air Solutions. But more importantly, tomorrow represented a commitment to a principle, that excellence could come in unexpected packages, that expertise didn't require conformity to traditional standards, that judging people by their abilities rather than their appearances wasn't just ethical, it was smart business. Marcus shut down his computer and prepared to leave, but paused at the door for one last look at his aircraft through the office window. Those jets represented his dreams, his ambitions, his success. But they also represented something else now, a reminder that the best help sometimes came from the most unexpected sources, and that being open to that help required humility, flexibility, and a willingness to challenge one's own biases. Tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. Riley arrived at Elite Air Solutions at 7:30 a.m. the next morning, driving a beat-up Ford pickup truck that looked like it had survived several apocalypses and a demolition derby. Marcus watched from his office window as she parked in the maintenance area, noting with amusement that she was wearing the same paint-splattered coveralls from their first meeting, or possibly a different pair that was identically stained. By 7:45, Riley was already under the cowling of the G650, her toolbox open beside her, surrounded by Marcus's maintenance crew, who seemed to be treating her with a mixture of respect and fascination. Thomas was explaining something about the aircraft's operational history, pointing at a tablet, while Riley nodded, asked questions, and occasionally made notes in a worn notebook she'd pulled from one of her many pockets. Marcus gave them space to work, occupying himself with administrative tasks and client calls, but periodically he found his attention drifting to the window, watching Riley move around the aircraft with that same confident efficiency he'd witnessed 3 weeks ago. Around 10 a.m., Jennifer knocked on his door with an unusual expression, something between concern and amusement. "You need to see this," she said, gesturing for him to follow. Marcus descended to the tarmac, where a small crowd had gathered near the G650. As he approached, He realized they weren't watching Riley work, they were listening to her teach. Riley stood beside the open engine cowling, her hands gesturing animatedly as she explained something to Thomas and 3 other members of the maintenance crew. On a portable whiteboard someone had brought out, she'd drawn a detailed diagram of the fuel system, marking various components and their interactions. And this is why the degradation happened faster than I initially predicted, Riley was saying, pointing to a specific junction on her diagram. The secondary pressure relief valve is designed to handle periodic stress from altitude changes. But when you're running extended high-altitude cruise profiles, the valve is operating near its upper limit for sustained periods. That accelerates wear on the diaphragm seal, which starts to leak small amounts of hydraulic fluid into the fuel system, which causes pressure fluctuations, which puts additional stress on the valve, creating a cascade effect. One of the younger mechanics, a man in his 20s named Danny, raised his hand tentatively. But the diagnostic system should have caught that cascade effect, right? I mean, that's what they're designed for. Should have, yes, Riley agreed. But here's the thing about diagnostic systems. They're programmed to look for specific patterns based on historical data. This particular cascade effect is relatively rare because most operators don't run the extended high-altitude profiles that Elite Air Solutions has been doing lately. So the diagnostic software doesn't recognize it as abnormal until it crosses a much higher threshold. Thomas crossed his arms, studying the diagram. So we've been flying a profile that's technically within manufacturer specifications, but it's stressing the system in ways the designers didn't fully anticipate. Exactly. Riley tapped the whiteboard with her marker. It's not a design flaw. Exactly. It's more like finding an edge case that reveals limitations in the system. The G650 is designed for luxury long-distance flights, but the typical usage pattern is more varied. Some short hops, some medium distances, occasional long flights. Elite Air Solutions runs a lot of consistent long-haul operations. You're using the aircraft exactly as designed, but you're using it more intensively than average. Marcus stepped forward, drawing Riley's attention. Is this going to be an ongoing problem? Do we need to change our operational profile? Riley considered the question, wiping a smear of grease from her cheek with the back of her hand. Not necessarily change it, but modify the maintenance schedule to account for it. I'd recommend inspecting the secondary pressure system every 100 flight hours instead of the standard 200. It adds some maintenance cost, but it prevents the kind of accelerated degradation we're seeing now. She turned back to the whiteboard, adding some notes. I'm also going to recommend an upgrade to the diagnostic software parameters. I'll write up a custom alert profile that looks specifically for the cascade pattern I described. That way, you'll get early warning before the degradation reaches critical levels. Danny raised his hand again. Can you teach us how to do that inspection? I mean, so we don't have to call you every time? Riley smiled, and Marcus saw genuine pleasure in her expression at being asked to share knowledge rather than just provide service. Absolutely. In fact, let me finish this repair, and then I'll walk you through the entire inspection process. You should all know how to identify early warning signs. For the next 3 hours, Marcus watched Riley transform from consultant to teacher. After completing the repair on the G650, which took exactly 6 hours and 45 minutes, well within her estimated timeline, she spent another 2 hours conducting an impromptu training session for the maintenance crew. She showed them diagnostic techniques that weren't in any manual, shared troubleshooting shortcuts she'd developed through years of experience, explained the subtle sensory cues, sounds, vibrations, smells that could indicate developing problems before any diagnostic system registered them. The crew absorbed the information like sponges, asking questions, taking notes, visibly growing in their understanding and confidence. Thomas, despite his decades of experience, admitted that Riley had shown him techniques he'd never considered. "You're a natural teacher," Marcus observed during a break, offering Riley a bottle of water as she wiped grease from her tools. Riley shrugged, but Marcus saw the pleasure the compliment brought. "My dad always said that hoarding knowledge is the fastest way to become obsolete. The more you share, the more you learn, because teaching forces you to really understand why things work, not just how." "Is that why you agreed to the contract, the teaching aspect?" Riley took a long drink of water before answering. "Partly, but also because of the email you sent yesterday." Marcus blinked in surprise. "How did you know about that?" "Thomas forwarded it to me, said he thought I should see how seriously you were taking our agreement." Riley met his eyes directly. "Most places talk about respecting expertise, regardless of appearance. You actually put it in writing, made it a company policy, held your staff accountable. That matters to me. It suggests you actually learned the lesson, not just acknowledged it." She pulled the contract from one of her coverall pockets, somehow still pristine, despite being surrounded by grease and grime. "I'm ready to sign if you are, but I want to be clear about expectations. I will never show up looking professional by conventional standards. I will always prioritize function over form. I will challenge your crew when I think they're wrong. I will recommend expensive solutions when they're necessary, even if cheaper options exist. And I will walk away if I feel like I'm being judged for anything other than the quality of my work." Marcus took the contract, scanning through the pages they'd both reviewed. "I wouldn't want it any other way. Your unconventional approach is what makes you excellent, not in spite of being unconventional, but because of it. You see things others miss because you're not constrained by traditional thinking." He pulled a pen from his pocket and signed the contract, then handed it to Riley for her signature. The moment felt significant, beyond the simple business transaction. It represented a commitment to principles that transcended standard operating procedures. Riley signed with a flourish, then tucked her copy back into her pocket. "Congratulations, Captain Webb. You just hired the messiest consultant in the aviation industry. I prefer to think of you as the most effective consultant in the aviation industry who happens to have a non-traditional aesthetic." Marcus offered his hand, and Riley shook it firmly. "Welcome to the team, Riley Cooper, officially." Over the next several weeks, Riley's presence at Elite Air Solutions became increasingly regular. She typically appeared once or twice a week, sometimes for scheduled inspections, sometimes responding to emergent issues, sometimes just to check on the crew and see how they were implementing the techniques she'd taught them. Her impact extended beyond just mechanical expertise. The maintenance crew, initially skeptical, had become vocal advocates for her methods. They began approaching problems with the same systematic, thorough analysis Riley demonstrated. They learned to trust their senses, the subtle warning signs that preceded diagnostic alerts. They grew more confident in their own abilities, but also more humble about the complexity of the systems they maintained. Marcus noticed the change in company culture too. With Riley as a visible example, staff members became more accepting of unconventional approaches in other areas. Jennifer mentioned that job interviews had shifted focus from appearance and resume formatting to actual competence and problem-solving ability. The hiring criteria had evolved to prioritize substance over style. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after Riley signed the contract, Marcus was in the maintenance hangar, reviewing some paperwork, when he overheard a conversation between Danny, the young mechanic, and a new hire named Sarah. "So what's the deal with Riley?" Sarah asked, clearly having heard stories, but not yet met the legendary consultant. "People talk about her like she's some kind of wizard." Danny laughed. "She's not a wizard. She's just ridiculously good at her job. And yeah, she looks like she sleeps in a dumpster, but you get over that in about 5 seconds once you see her work." Last week, she diagnosed a developing hydraulic issue just by listening to the landing gear cycle. Didn't even need to look at diagnostics, just heard something in the sound that wasn't right. Is she really as tough as people say? I heard she once told off a pilot for questioning her expertise. That was Captain Webb, actually, before my time, but Thomas told me about it. Webb judged her based on how she looked, and Riley basically challenged him to see past his assumptions. Now they're like, I don't know, mutual respect society or something. Webb treats her like his most valuable consultant, which she is. Sarah was quiet for a moment. So she's good enough that people overlook how she presents herself? No, Danny corrected firmly. That's not it. She's good, period. How she presents herself is irrelevant. That's the point. Riley does excellent work regardless of whether she's wearing paint-covered overalls or a tuxedo. The question isn't whether we can overlook her appearance. The question is why we ever thought appearance mattered in the first place. Marcus felt a surge of pride hearing those words from one of his youngest crew members. The lesson had taken root, had spread, had become part of the company's DNA. That evening, Marcus was preparing to leave for the day when he saw Riley's truck still parked in the maintenance area. Curious, he walked out to the hangar and found her sitting on her toolbox, notebook open, sketching something while referring to a tablet propped against a nearby workbench. "Burning the midnight oil?" Marcus called out. Riley looked up, slightly startled, then smiled. "Just working on that diagnostic software upgrade I promised you. The custom alert profile for the Cascade degradation pattern. Wanted to finish it while the specifications were fresh in my mind." Marcus walked closer, looking at her sketch. A complex flowchart with notes in the margins. "You're doing this now at 7 p.m. after a full day of work?" "This isn't work, this is interesting." Riley gestured at her notebook. "There's a difference. When you're solving a puzzle that matters, time kind of disappears." Marcus settled onto a nearby stool, watching her work for a moment. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Depends on how personal." "Why do you really dress like that? I mean, I understand the functional aspect. You're often working in messy conditions. But even in situations where appearance might be advantageous, you maintain the same aesthetic. Is it purely principle, or is there more to it?" Riley set down her pencil, considering the question. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that suggested this was territory she didn't often discuss. "After my dad died, I went through a phase where I tried to fit in. MIT was full of polished, professional people who dressed like they were always ready for a corporate interview. I bought the right clothes, styled my hair properly, wore minimal makeup, tried to look like I belonged in that world." She picked up a wrench from her toolbox, turning it over in her hands. "But every time I looked in the mirror, I saw someone pretending to be something she wasn't. I wasn't an academic. I wasn't a corporate engineer. I was my father's daughter, a mechanic who loved machines and didn't give a damn about impressing people with superficial qualities." "So you made a conscious choice to reject that image?" "I made a conscious choice to be authentic. These clothes." Riley gestured at her stained coveralls. "This is who I am. I work with my hands. I get dirty. I prioritize function over form. And if people can't see past the grease stains to the expertise underneath, that's their limitation, not mine." She met Marcus's eyes directly. "The world wants women in STEM to be polished and presentable, to prove that you can be technical and feminine, smart and attractive. But that requirement, that's just another form of discrimination. It says your expertise isn't enough. You also have to perform femininity in an acceptable way. I refuse to play that game." Marcus nodded slowly, understanding more than he had before. "So, when I judged you that first day, I wasn't just being superficial. I was reinforcing a system that demands women prove their worth on multiple fronts, while men only have to be competent. And now you're getting it." Riley returned to her sketch, adding some annotations. Though, to be fair, plenty of men face similar judgments based on different criteria. Race, age, accent, body type. There are lots of ways people get dismissed before they have a chance to demonstrate what they can do. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, Riley working on her diagrams while Marcus processed their conversation. The hangar was quiet, except for the distant sounds of aircraft operations and the scratching of Riley's pencil. "You know what's funny?" Marcus finally said. "I built this business on the principle of exceeding expectations, of delivering excellence. But I almost missed out on the person who embodies those principles better than anyone I've ever met, all because she didn't meet my superficial expectations of what expertise should look like." Riley glanced up with a slight smile. "Almost? But you didn't. You learned. That's rare, Marcus. Most people double down on their assumptions, find reasons to justify their initial judgment. You actually changed your mind when presented with evidence. That's why I agreed to work with you. High praise from someone who doesn't give it easily. I don't believe in false flattery, but I do believe in recognizing growth." Riley closed her notebook with a decisive snap. "Okay, diagnostic upgrade is sketched out. I'll code it properly tomorrow and have it ready for implementation by the end of the week." She stood, stretching muscles that had been stationary for too long, then began packing her tools with practiced efficiency. Marcus watched, thinking about how normal this had become. Riley in his hangar, her expertise woven into the fabric of his company, her presence a constant reminder of lessons learned and principles upheld. "Riley," Marcus said as she hefted her toolbox, "thank you. Not just for the technical work, but for teaching me, teaching all of us, something important about judgment and value and what really matters." Riley paused at the hangar door, silhouetted against the evening sky. "Just keep learning, Marcus. Keep questioning your assumptions. Keep evaluating people on what they do rather than how they look. That's all the thanks I need." She walked out into the twilight, her mismatched boots echoing on the concrete, her silhouette gradually disappearing into the parking area. Marcus stood alone in the hangar, surrounded by the aircraft he loved, thinking about the journey that had brought him here. 6 weeks ago, he'd been a man convinced he knew how to recognize expertise, certain of his ability to judge competence. He'd built a successful business based on attention to detail, high standards, and uncompromising excellence. But he'd been missing a crucial piece of wisdom. Excellence doesn't conform to expectations. It transcends them. Real expertise doesn't need the trappings of professionalism to validate itself. Quality speaks through results, not appearance. Riley Cooper, in her paint-splattered coveralls and mismatched boots, had taught him that lesson. And in doing so, she hadn't just saved his aircraft or improved his maintenance operations. She'd made him a better person, a more thoughtful leader, and a wiser judge of character. The hangar lights flickered automatically as the motion sensors detected his movement toward the exit. Marcus took one last look at his aircraft. Pristine, powerful, representing his dreams made real, and smiled. Tomorrow, Riley would return with her completed diagnostic upgrade. Next week, she'd conduct another training session for the crew. Next month, she'd probably identify some developing issue before it became critical, saving time and money and possibly lives. But more importantly, every time Riley walked onto his tarmac, she would carry with her a reminder that assumptions are dangerous, that judgment based on appearance is foolish, and that excellence, true excellence, comes in many forms, sometimes the most unexpected ones. Marcus turned off the hangar lights and walked into the evening, grateful for the lesson, grateful for Riley's expertise, and most grateful of all, for the humility to learn from someone he'd almost dismissed. In the parking lot, Riley's beat-up pickup truck disappeared down the access road, its taillights glowing red against the darkening sky. And somewhere in Phoenix, in the garage or hangar or workshop, Riley Cooper would continue doing what she did best, fixing machines, challenging assumptions, and proving that excellence requires no disguise except competence, no validation except results, and no justification except the undeniable quality of the work itself. The end.